This is episode number 42, featuring watercolor master Antonio Masi, who talks about why he switched from oil to watercolor. Welcome to the PleinAir Podcast from PleinAir Magazine. I'm your host, Eric Rhoads, founder and publisher of PleinAir Magazine. In the PleinAir Podcast, we dive into the world of outdoor painting called plein air painting. For those of you who don't know, plein air is a French term that essentially means open air or outdoors, and it's become known for painting outdoors. The French say plein air, others say plein air. Doesn't really matter how you say it, but there is a huge movement of artists around the world going outdoors to paint, and this show is about the movement. This week's podcast is brought to you by the PleinAir Convention, the largest gathering of plein air artists in history, coming up late April in San Diego. You can still get seats, possibly. It's coming up in just a couple of weeks, and we're on the verge of selling out. In fact, it could be sold out by the time you hear this, so if you have interest, get to the website, PleinAirConvention.com. And if it's sold out, join the waiting list in case somebody can't make it. It's 5 days of indoor instruction by over 80 instructors. Now with oil, acrylic, watercolor, water media, pastel, even sculpting demos this year. Then we all go painting together around beautiful San Diego, and it's historic because we beat the world's record once again for the most number of people painting together in one place outdoors. And if you're new to plein air painting or you've never tried it, we have a pre-convention course on the basics of plein air painting to help you save time and get it down. And we also have a pre-convention workshop, which is almost sold out, with master artist Kwang Ho. Learn more at PleinAirConvention.com. It's my desire to see more people fall in love with painting and with plein air painting, and you can help by sharing this podcast with your friends on social media or email, or tell them to look up and search PleinAir Podcast on iTunes. I hope you'll subscribe on iTunes so it comes to you every week. And of course, we'd love for you to leave a comment, give us a nice rating, or a bad rating if we deserve it. Hopefully we don't. And we'd love your feedback. You can email me, Eric, at PleinAirMagazine.com. The interview is brought to you by something brand new that our company Streamline is doing. It's a new conference, finally a figurative painters conference, something that's been needed. The Figurative Art Convention and Expo, FACE, Figurative Art Convention and Expo in Miami at the historic Biltmore Hotel, November 7th through 11th. That'll be a nice time to go to Miami. And it will be like the plein air convention, fun, exhilarating, entertaining, hands-on, but all indoors. Instructors include, so far, Jacob Collins, Max Ginsberg, Juliet Aristides, Daniel Graves, David LaFell, Stephen Assail, Sherry McGraw, Jeremy Lipking, Braden Parrish, Jordan Sakal, John Coleman, and Cesar Santos. That's just starters. Learn more at figurativeartconvention.com. And remember, this one's going to be very limited in attendance. It's the first one. We also are including the track conference into the convention. So go to figurativeartconvention.com. Let's get started right now with our interview with the renowned watercolor master, Antonio Masi. Well, I'm absolutely thrilled to have Antonio Masi on with us today. Antonio, welcome to the PleinAir Podcast.
Thank you.
So how long have you been plein air painting?
About 17 years, I would say.
Wow. Okay, terrific. So for those of our audience who may not know, and I think probably everybody knows who you are because you're one of the most incredible watercolor painters on earth, you're now the president, is that right, of the AWS?
Yes, I'm president of the American Watercolor Society, probably the oldest continuous, society in America right now.
Well, it must keep you busy.
Oh, especially this year because we're having our 150th international exhibition.
Wow.
We've had a show for 150 years every year.
So where is the show going to be held?
In New York at the Sullivan Club this year.
Uh-huh. That's a great facility. I'm a member. And does AWS get everybody together for any kind of instruction or anything like that? Do you have an annual event that you do for watercolor instruction?
No, we don't have an annual watercolor instruction, but we do have our annual dinner and award ceremony every year at the Sullivan Club, which is attended by more than 150 people.
Wow. And what are the dates of that this year?
This year will be April 21st, Friday.
All right. Excellent. Well, congratulations on that. So what have you found are the initiatives of what you have to try and accomplish as the president of the AWS?
Well, the main reason I took the job as president was because I believe in the power of watercolor. I think watercolor, to me, and I started out, by the way, as an oil painter.
Oh, you did?
Oh, yes. I'm a convert. And I realized that the power of watercolor has so much in it that is not understood by so many people. It is the oldest medium in the world, by the way. I'm sure you know that. It's over 6,000 years old, whereas oil is about 600. So longevity, watercolor, is there.
So what was it about watercolor that made you want to convert from oil painting?
It could do almost everything that oil does and more. The subtleties of changes of color, the nuances that occur in watercolor. And the most important thing to me is watercolor is alive. It flows. It has a life of its own. When you put down an oil paint, it's there. It doesn't move on you unless you dilute it, with turpentine, whatnot. But in watercolor, you put it down, you have to watch it, and you watch it grow, and you watch it flow, and you watch it alive. There's a flow to it. There's a rhythm to it that other mediums don't have.
And there's a bit of accidental magic.
Well, that accidental magic is really not accidental if you think about it, because when you do so much watercolor, after a while, you develop an inner sense of how it moves. And you kind of anticipate something's going to happen. And if you see it and you like it, you try to stop it at that point. It reacts to you. It reacts to your work.
So you have to really learn to manipulate it, though. You have, you're probably moving the paper around to keep drips going in different directions or create special effects of that nature. Is that right?
That's part of it, yes.
Yeah. So it's.
But the painter Edgar Whitney said that watercolor is a master's medium, and he advised people not to start with watercolor, but to start with oils. Learn how to paint first with oils, and then you switch to watercolor or try it. Because, in oils you can correct, you can scrape out, you can build up, you can correct. Watercolor, on the other hand, doesn't give you that much of flexibility. You've got to know what you're doing.
I've often heard that watercolor is much more difficult to paint with than oil because you have to think with the end in mind from the very beginning. For a great example of that would be, when you want your whites, you have to kind of figure out how to leave the paper showing. It takes a lot of discipline and patience. With oil, of course, if you make a mistake, you can cover right over it. With water, it's something you have to live with, isn't it?
To a degree, yes. But the new colors and the new papers and materials we have, you can get down almost back to the basic white of the paper by scrubbing out the paint.
Really?
There's very, very little difference between the paints that are used by painters and watercolor artists because the pigment is the same. The only difference between oil and watercolor is the medium. In oils, they use linseed oil. In watercolor, we use, the gum arabic.
Right.
But basically, the ingredients are the same.
Right. Pigment is pigment.
That's right. So there's a misconception about watercolor that it's not permanent. Wait a minute, we're using the same pigment, fellas. What do you mean it's not permanent? The Sistine Chapel is a water-based painting. That's lasted a long time. So, there's a misconception, in other words, and I just feel as the president of AWS, I'm very passionate about it, as you can see.
Yeah, I can see. So what about the critics who, I've heard this, I don't know that know that it's true, but I've heard that galleries sometimes say it's harder to sell a watercolor painting, or I've heard that they have concerns about archival life.
It's true. What they're saying is true, but it's all a misconception. Maybe it was true about a while back before the pigments became more permanent. And one of the problems with watercolor is that during the Industrial Revolution, the dyeing of fabrics was very popular, all these beautiful new colors, but they were not permanent. And the same kind of dyes were being used to make watercolors. So the color then started to fade, which is true. They have some legitimate reasons for saying that. But today, those reasons don't exist anymore. And that's just a carryover from the Victorian era about the misconception of the permanence of watercolor. And the galleries have been living, and the museums too, have been living with this myth and perpetuating it and sell it that way. And they say, oh no, watercolors are too delicate, we can't show it. Watercolor in a museum is always put in a little dark corner where there isn't any light to really appreciate the beauty of it. It really is a matter of trying to explain to people that watercolor today is permanent, just like the other colors. And the paper, a 300 sheet of watercolor paper is tough, just as tough as any linen. But it's a slow process of education, of introducing, of making people aware of what's happening.
So for somebody who is, let's say somebody like me, an oil painter, decides they want to take up watercolor. Now, I have small portable watercolor sets that I actually take with me. I always have watercolor in my suitcase just in case I want to paint, but I don't use it very much. But for somebody like me, or somebody who's an oil painter, or somebody who's not experienced in watercolor painting, what is the proper process for learning? What are the proper materials so that you don't get the wrong thing? How do you get us started?
Well, you're a painter, and you have experience as a painter. You don't need to be taught how to paint. You know all the fundamentals and the basics of painting. My only suggestion to someone like you or anyone else is to start to paint. Don't think it's watercolor. It's paint. Treat it as paint. Watch it. Follow it at the beginning. See what it does. There is no magic to teaching watercolor. If you can paint in oils, you can paint in watercolor. But if you paint in watercolor at the beginning, you will have a hard time understanding what painting is. And that's why I suggest that people who want to paint in watercolor, and they should, I think everybody should have an experience in that, should learn how to paint first. Paint with a medium that you can control and make it do what you want it to do. I can say to you, oh, you don't have to wet the sheet. All you have to do is stop blocking it out with a light color and then fill in with the other colors. Basically, that's what oil painters do. There is no really main difference, except that watercolor is fast. It's quick, whereas oil is a little slower. It doesn't dry as fast.
So you mentioned wetting the sheet. Is this something that is pretty much a standard practice, or do you not recommend doing that?
I don't do it myself, but I know other artists who do.
Uh-huh.
There's a Oriental painter, Chen Ji, who does beautiful color painting in watercolor. He wets the sheet. He throws colors into it. He watches the colors, and then when he sees something, he starts to pull it out and develop it. That's the beauty of watercolor. And this technique, by the way, goes back to Turner, where they used that approach. Watercolor sort of stirs the imagination, the inner creative force in you, brings it out.
Well, Turner must have been using the materials at the time of Turner must have been the ones that faded, because I had a friend that owned I think it's called the Blue Rishi, who it was kept under velvet at all times because they were concerned about fading. It's a magnificent painting.
Yes.
So would the materials from that era have been much like the dyes that you were referring to? It's just
some of the colors, yes.
More fading more. Uh-huh.
Yeah, would fade more. Now, this is true, some of them. But today, we don't have to be concerned with that.
Right.
And yet, it still perpetuates. It's still out there. And it's perpetuated by the galleries because now they have a financial investment in this.
Right.
And that's very important to a gallery owner, because that, in essence, that's why they're in business,
Sure.
to make money.
Right. Well, tell me about how you got started in painting, Antonio.
Oh, that goes back to high school. I went to an art high school called the High School of Industrial Arts in New York. It was basically a vocational school where we were taught the fundamentals of painting, drawing, lettering, advertising layouts, things like that, so that after high school, we went out and got a job. And that's what we did, and that's what I did for a while. After high school, I went out and got a job in the art field. Then later on, I went back and I went to the School of Visual Arts for 3 years, where I wanted to get a little bit more involved in art, and I got involved more in the fine arts.
So were you making a living as an artist at the time?
Yes.
And what kind of things were you doing? Were you doing illustration?
Illustrations. Also worked because I love to draw, I also worked for a magazine called, not a magazine, a newspaper at that time called Women's Wear Daily, where we used to go out into the field every day into the showrooms and sketch the models and come back in the late afternoon, bring the sketches in, and they'd be published in the newspaper the next day.
Were they in gray and white or black and white?
They were in black and white and gray.
What a wonderful experience that was, though.
It was terrific. For 5 years, they were sent us. Well, I did it for 5 years. They would send us out into the field, and we just drew all day and got paid for it. How much fun can that be?
Yeah. Well, and what great experience. So who were some of the people that you studied under?
Well, one of the people was Bern Hogarth. He was an anatomy teacher, which was good. Insofar as any of the painters, there was an abstract painter named Lowe, Herb Lowe. They were not, I would say, the big known painters, but they were good teachers.
And what about anatomy? I don't know that I don't recall you doing figurative work anymore, but maybe I'm wrong about that. But how important is anatomy in your mind for someone who's learning painting?
Well, I don't look at it as anatomy. I go every Monday night. My wife and I, my wife who's also a painter, marvelous portrait painter, we go to a life drawing class every Monday night for 3 hours, and we draw. It is not the drawing of the figure that is important to me. It is the training of the hand and eye and the brain coordination. How to see things. How do you see? If you can draw a figure adequately, you could probably draw anything out there in any medium. Because drawing is the fundamental thing about art. It's the basis. And it really trains you to have hand and eye coordination, to see relationship of shapes and the transformation of something in front of you which is small, and then when you draw it larger on your paper, and you have to make that transition of the small to the large and reproportion all the edges and all the sides so that it works. It's an exercise in developing your brain and your skills. And I've been doing this every Monday night. And I don't show my figures. I don't show my figure drawings because that to me is my training. I'm teaching myself. I am my own instructor.
How many years have you been doing live figure drawing? It's probably from the beginning, right?
Yeah. I mean, like at women's wear early while I was doing it every day. It's just nothing more than for me, a hand and eye coordination.
Right. Well, I do it every week. I follow that practice. I have a model come in once a week. I have a small group of people, and we sketch for 3 hours every single week. And it's amazing how rusty you get just by not doing that. So I highly recommend it, and I see the value.
I totally agree with you. You know, you can go one week without doing it. You can go 2 weeks. By the third week, everybody knows you have no troubles. Yeah.
I always often tell the story of Max Ginsberg. We had Max Ginsberg do one of our videos one time, and Max came in and he said, "I painted every day for the last 7 days to get ready for this." I said, "Max, you've been painting for 60 years." And he said, "Listen, if I don't paint consistently for, 3 or 4 days in a row," he said, "I just don't do it justice." So even a guy like that who is world renowned and we all think he's masterful, he's constantly practicing.
Well, I remember Max because for a while I was teaching art at the High School of Industrial Art. I was the art chairman there for a while. And Max was one of the teachers working with me. And Max would come in like at 5:30 in the morning with a small group of really very talented young artists, and they would paint together until school started, which would be around 8:30. This is how much Max works and believes very strongly in what he does. And he's a very giving person also.
Yeah, he really is. And he told me that story. He told me that I said, "How did you get so good?" And he told me the story about how, I think he said for several years in a row, he and his buddies would get up at 4:30 in the morning, show up at 5 in the morning and paint till 9 or 10, do that 5 days a week, and did it for years.
Yes, he did. And I always admired him for that. I couldn't get up that early.
Yeah, I feel like a real slacker now talking about that.
But a lot of talented young artists came out of that group. A lot.
I think Stephen Assail was one of his students.
Yes, he was. Yeah. Steve. And also the other person in that group was Irving Greenberg.
Oh, yeah, Greenie.
Yeah, who was the watercolor artist.
Right. So how long did you paint in oil, and then when did you make the transition over to water?
I painted in oils, I would say, most of the time in my life. But I switched to watercolor about 2003, 2004, in that era. My wife, who's the oil painter, plus the pastelist and watercolor artist, all of them, and I admire that. She can do it all. I kept getting frustrated. I said, I just can't get what I want. She says, why don't you try watercolor? So about 2003, 2004, I went to the art store and I bought some watercolors. And I had done watercolors when I was in high school. That's probably something that I tend to overlook. I did get training in watercolor in high school. And when I got the watercolors, I started painting. And I was so amazed because I never looked back again after that. I was able to get the effects I wanted when I wanted it without having to work so hard. It was just like a duck took to water. I couldn't believe myself, honestly.
So for those of us who don't have any experience or very little experience in watercolor, let's talk about materials for a second. I have, I have access to a lot of things because of the magazine and the convention and get to know the vendors and so on. But I don't really know what's good and what's not. But I've seen watercolor in pans, in cakes. I've seen it in what I think are in tubes, or is that gouache? I know gouache is in tubes, but is there watercolor in tubes as well?
Yes, there are basically three levels of watercolor. You have the student grade.
Right.
And that's in those little pans.
Right.
Then you have, the next level, which is also is in a tube.
Uh-huh.
But that tube is called the scholastic type, which basically is cheaper paint in a tube. The paint is not so refined, and there is more impurities in it. Then you have the professional grade of watercolor, which is the same quality, fine pigment that is used, say, in the making of oil paints. Right. Winsor Newton, for example, uses the same pigment, the professional grade, for both the oils and the watercolor, but just changes the medium for it, either linseed oil or gum arabic. So if you want the richest possible quality of colors, and I always say to people, if you have to skimp, don't skimp on your art supplies. You have enough problems at the beginning to paint without having to fight the materials. You don't need a lot, but whatever you buy the best.
So do you mix color on a palette, like you would in oil? Let's say you're trying to make a green. Do you mix a blue and a red, or do you try to get a tube color so that you don't do any mixing? Do you mix on the paper itself?
Mix all my colors. I use butcher's trays, which is similar to a palette. I have two big butcher's trays. I lay out on one tray, I lay out all my warm colors from light to dark. On my other tray, I lay out all my cool colors from light to dark. So I have two trays, one warm, one cool. That's in my studio, I do that. And I use the interior part of the butcher's tray to mix my colors on. My paintings are rather large, my watercolors.
Yeah, they're huge.
Yeah, so I need large areas to mix. And I need large quantities of paint, so I use many times bowls to mix quantity of paints in them. I don't use the paint the way they come out of the tubes. They're too raw. They're not personal enough.
So how do you make a paint personal?
By making my own mixtures of paint.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if I'm going to use a blue, I won't use a cobalt blue or ultramarine blue or cerulean blue or Prussian blue. I will use a couple of blues in different percentages. So that new blue I have does not exist in any tube anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So I always mix a minimum of 2 colors together when I paint.
And that's because you don't want the appearance of anything that is right out of the tube.
Absolutely right.
Right.
Doesn't look like it's a commercial rendering or a commercial product. It's a personal way of painting.
Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of us in oil painting tend to gray down our colors to give them a less garish appearance. Do you do the same kind of thing when you're mixing these colors together for that purpose?
Yes, to some degree it is. Also, there is another thing that the painter, Edgar Payne, I'm sure you're familiar with him.
Oh, absolutely.
He used to have his mother color in his work. That color that sort of was prevalent in everything in the whole canvas, that sort of held the whole painting together. So when I look at a painting, when I'm going to do a painting, I should say, I look at it and say, what's dominant color out here? And that dominant color to me is more or less the thing that will hold everything else together. And Edgar Payne used the term the mother color, which sort of held everything together, just like a mother does in any family.
So is that would that be like an underpainting then?
No.
Toning of canvas?
No.
So you're just if you're looking at a field of green, so to speak, then you say to yourself, okay, this is a primarily warm green tone that is going to dominate this canvas.
Well, let's say using percentages, using your green. The green will occupy, say, 55, 60% of my canvas. And the rest is broken up to 20% of blue and another 20% the brown, save the rocks or whatnot, or the water, whatever it is. That green is the dominant color. So Edgar Payne, if I recall, what he used to do is when he painted the blue, he would make sure he put a tiny dab of that green in the blue. A tiny dab of that green, say in the brown or the whatever other color. So that green was in every other color on his canvas that sort of tied them together. This is how I recall he used his mother color. It was not an underpainting. That's different, or toning the canvas. That's something else.
So just a touch, obviously.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. You don't want to make the blue not appear blue. But just enough to sort of
harmonize.
Skew it or harmonize it. So there was a harmony through all the colors. And all his paintings always had this harmony of color. Until I realized when he mentions it in his wonderful book, Composition of Outdoor Painting. It's a marvelous little book.
Yeah. It's like the Bible of composition. It's fabulous. I think
when I was doing oil painting, one of the people carried it around with him all the time outdoors. And before he started to paint, he kept flipping through it to see how he's going to start. It's a Bible.
Yeah.
Literally, it is a Bible.
Yeah, it's fabulous. So, who would you look to as inspirations in the watercolor world? Obviously, Sargent had these amazing watercolors. Who else really turned you on from history that we should look up and get inspired by?
Turner. He did things with watercolor towards the end of his life which looked so abstract, so modern, that I think he's overlooked. And he made watercolor do what he wanted to do. He made it sing. And there was nothing that he couldn't paint with watercolor. But also, he went into oils because at that time oil was the dominant medium and still is, unfortunately, today, and which would sell more and make more money. But Turner is a marvelous watercolor artist.
Absolutely.
He really set the tone for watercolor. And he was also a great outdoor painter.
So when you're plein air painting, do you just do you have an easel? Do you set a piece of paper on your lap? What's your process?
I have an easel. I have my traveling watercolor kit, my brushes, my water. I have a little stool at my age. I need a little chair to sit when I paint. And I have a complete setup. It's basically the same one as I used in oil painting, but only converted it to watercolor.
Excellent. Well, I know for the watercolor people listening, I sound like a complete Luddite because I don't know the answers to these, but I find it fascinating. And you have inspired me. I'm going to go get my watercolors and do something this weekend just so that I can learn a little bit more about some of the things you've talked about. So you talked a little bit about colors and making sure we get professional colors. How do you pick the paper that you're painting on?
I use the best paper I can buy. I buy 300-pound paper. 300-pound is, and I mean, manufacturers, there's Fabriano out there, there's Arches. There's a lot of good manufacturers. I mean, I don't have one is not better than the other. They're all good. It's a matter of personal taste. One has a little more of a texture. The other one absorbs a little bit more. You have to kind of experiment to see which one you relate to. But because when it comes down to it, even the colors you buy are going to be personal. You like this blue better than that blue. Mm-hmm. It's personal. So you go with your instincts. But I buy 300-pound watercolor paper because I have a tendency of almost beating up my watercolors. By that I mean I will paint it and I will scrub it out, wash it out, and then paint it again, and then I'll go back again and do it again. So it takes a beating.
How do you wash it out or scrub it out?
With water. I almost get down to the white of the paper. And the other thing that I do, I can bleach out the paper. Again, if I don't like the color, I can almost bleach it all out with say, Clorox and water.
Oh, interesting. So,
and then make sure you wash the Clorox out completely with clear water when you do that. So you don't want to burn the paper.
That doesn't change the color of the paper at all?
No.
So what's the process? Of course, every oil painter has a little bit different process, but typically in oil painting, we're painting thin with a Gamsol or with a Terps or something, and then we're laying in color over that. And a lot of people start with the shadows and then build from there. Is the process very similar for you, or do you go differently in terms of how you started painting?
I think I start watercolor a little different than most watercolor artists because of my background. I start with the darks. I paint or block in my darks first. And to me, that is the foundation. That's going to be the framework for my painting. Mm-hmm. I don't want a painting that's going to look thin and watery, and as the term that's used nowadays sometimes is called wishy-washy. So I start with my strong darks, and I block those in, and I work with it. If that doesn't come out right, I'll start on another one. It's
Excellent.
like building a house.
Right. Start with the foundation.
If that foundation isn't right, I don't care how pretty your window is going to be or how fancy the door you're going to get. It's not going to hold up. I start with my darks and I attack it from that point of view.
Who among, I know you're in a difficult position here because you're head of an organization which has a lot of members, but I'm going to ask you a tough question anyway. Who among the watercolor artists living today, who are some of the artists who perhaps inspire you or would inspire the rest of us?
Okay, that is a tough question because it's a matter of personal taste about inspiration.
Right.
There are some artists whose work I love very much, but I wouldn't paint like them because it's not me.
Right.
And I always tell people, respect, admire, learn from every other artist. You can learn something from everyone, regardless of who they are. But at the end, you've got to be yourself. You cannot be even a turner or even try to be a sergeant because people say, oh, that's very good, looks like a sergeant. Wait a minute, you have just lost your identity. I admire a lot of artists, tremendous number of artists, and they're all very good, and I try to learn from all of them. But in the end, when I paint like Antonio Masi.
Well, that's great advice. How does an artist find their own voice? I hear this question constantly. Is they don't want to paint like their mentors, but they have a hard time finding out what their own voice is.
I think we don't trust ourselves enough. We're always looking for that silver bullet that will make us the artist that we want to be. And it's always been there inside us. All we have to do is trust ourselves. Be honest. You paint the way you paint. You have your own personal choice of colors. You have likes and dislikes. Use all of these normal things you have within you, built you. Remember, we have spent a lifetime learning things, and we tend to put them aside when we want to be like somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying, you've lost it. You've lost being yourself. You've got to be yourself. It's your handwriting. Your art is just like your handwriting. You can never change it, or you modify it, yes, but nobody else could ever copy it. So if you look at your work as though this is your signature, and you try to make it as beautiful as you can, you practice. You practice like Max does every day. That's a true artist. He found himself because he paints like Max, because Max is Max. And whoever you are, be yourself. But I'm not saying don't learn from everybody. You must learn from other people. Remember, we are a group of artists who go back thousands of years, and we have learned from each other. And I hope the next generations, I can contribute a little drop of something so the next generation can build on that.
Well, I think you've inspired us today to give it a shot. I don't know about you. I mean, I don't know about the other people listening, but I'm going to give it a shot. You've given me something to try and something to get excited about. I've spent most of my time in oil painting. I haven't done watercolors much, and I think I'm going to get back into it and play with it, go get some good materials, and see what I can come up with. Get that 300-pound paper.
And since you are an oil painter, don't forget to use your oil painting brushes when you do watercolors.
Really?
That is you. That is you. Don't forget. I don't want you to be anything but who you are. Paint just like you paint your oils. The only difference is the medium. And then you're going to start discovering things about the medium. It's the only way you're going to do it. again, don't look to outside sources. You have all the answers within you. All you have to do is adapt them to the new medium.
Well, that's great advice, Antonio, and it's been a pleasure having you on today, and I think you've inspired us all. So thank you so much, sir.
Thank you for calling. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, thanks again to Antonio Masi. What a wonderful interview. We'll always learn a lot from these things. Sponsored by the PleinAir Convention, held this April in San Diego, with some of the most amazing artists in the world as faculty to teach you. Learn more at PleinAirConvention.com. It's just around the corner. I'm really looking forward to it. I look forward to this every year. It's one of the highlights of my year. We're going to be doing some really cool new things in marketing boot camp, including a way to increase your art business by 30% without much effort. Also, for those who want the ultimate retirement, how to set up a quick business and retirement business as an artist. And we have Jay Abraham, who is probably the best marketing mind in the world. He's the guy the billionaires call for marketing advice. He consults for Tony Robbins, Damien John from Shark Tank, a lot of people. He's literally generated billions and billions and billions of dollars in business. And he happens to be an art collector. We happen to be friends, and I talked him into coming to the PleinAir Convention for Art Marketing Boot Camp one morning, and it's going to be powerful. You don't want to miss that. This is something very unusual. Well, the PleinAir movement is still red hot, which may be why PleinAir Magazine remains victorious, as the top representational art magazine sold nationwide at Barnes & Noble. Drop by, pick one up at the newsstands, or get a bi-monthly subscription of your own for about half the price in the newsstand at PleinAirMagazine.com. Well, this is always fun for me to do. It's fun for me to learn from other people. Let's do this again sometime, like next week. We will see you then. I'm Eric Rhoads, publisher and founder of PleinAir Magazine. And remember, it's a big world out there, so go paint it. We'll see you. Bye-bye.